In the spring of 1838, in Charleston County, South Carolina, something happened that made plantation owners across the state start watching their house slaves with new suspicion. A woman named Rebecca, a master who died over the course of 18 months in ways that looked like illness but weren't, and a revenge so patient, so calculated, that by the time anyone understood what was happening, it was far too late to stop it. If stories about the long game matter to you, about how the powerless can destroy the powerful when they're willing to wait years for justice, then stay with me. Because what Rebecca did between 1836 and 1838 tells you everything you need to know about patience, about rage that burns cold instead of hot, and about why some forms of revenge are measured in months instead of moments. The year 1836 sits deep in the antebellum period, when slavery in South Carolina was at its most profitable and most brutal. Rice plantations dominated the coastal regions, producing enormous wealth for white owners through the backbreaking labor of enslaved people working in malarial swamps. Charleston was one of the largest slave markets in the South. Families were bought and sold daily. Children were separated from mothers as casually as livestock. The system was operating at peak efficiency, grinding human beings into profit with industrial precision. Rebecca was born around 1815 on a rice plantation near Charleston. By 1836, she was 21 years old and had spent her entire life enslaved. She'd been born into bondage, had never known freedom, had watched the system destroy everyone around her with methodical cruelty. But Rebecca had something that made her both valuable and vulnerable. She was beautiful. In a system where enslaved women had no protection from sexual violence, beauty was a curse that marked you as a target. By the time she was 15, Rebecca had caught the attention of the man who owned her, Malcolm Hendricks. Malcolm Hendricks was 42 years old in 1836. He'd inherited his plantation from his father, had grown up wealthy and entitled, had never questioned his right to own other human beings. He was married to a woman named Catherine, had 3 children, was respected in Charleston society as a successful planter and devout Christian. He was also a rapist who'd been sexually abusing Rebecca since she was 15 years old. It started the way these things always started on plantations, with absolute power and complete vulnerability. Hendricks would summon Rebecca to the main house, would send his wife and children away on errands, would assault Rebecca in his study or bedroom or wherever was convenient. Rebecca had no recourse. She couldn't refuse. That would mean a whipping or being sold away to worse conditions. She couldn't report it. Who would she report it to? Hendricks owned her legally. Under the law, she was his property to use however he wanted. So Rebecca endured. 6 years of regular assaults. 6 years of being treated as property for Hendricks's gratification. 6 years of rage building inside her with nowhere to go. By 1836, when Rebecca was 21, something inside her reached a breaking point. Not a sudden explosion. Rebecca was too smart for that. But a quiet, cold decision. Hendricks would die. Not quickly, not mercifully. He would die slowly, over months, suffering every step of the way. And he would never know it was Rebecca killing him. Rebecca had advantages that made her plan possible. She worked in the main house as a lady's maid and cook. She had access to Hendricks's food, his drinks, his personal items. She had privacy to work without constant supervision. And she had knowledge. Years of watching older enslaved women use herbs and plants for medicine had taught her which substances helped and which ones harmed. Rebecca began researching carefully. She would sneak into Hendrick's library when the family was away and read his medical books. She'd talk to older enslaved women about traditional remedies, asking questions that seemed innocent but were actually gathering information about poisons. What Rebecca learned was that the human body could be destroyed slowly through careful, consistent exposure to certain substances. You didn't need a massive dose that would kill immediately and trigger investigation. You needed small amounts, administered regularly, that would cause cumulative damage over time. The genius of slow poisoning was that it looked like illness. The victim would sicken gradually, doctors would be consulted, treatments would be prescribed, all while the poison continued its work. By the time anyone suspected foul play, the victim would be too far gone to save. Rebecca spent months planning. She identified the substances she would use, a combination of compounds from several different plants, each contributing to different symptoms. She figured out how to extract and prepare them. She determined the dosing schedule that would cause maximum damage while minimizing immediate suspicion. And in January 1836, Rebecca began killing Malcolm Hendricks. She started with his morning coffee. Hendricks was particular about his coffee, wanted it strong and sweet, prepared exactly the same way every morning. Rebecca had been making his coffee for years. He trusted it completely, never questioned it, never thought twice about drinking it. Rebecca began adding tiny amounts of white snake root extract to the coffee. Not enough to cause immediate symptoms, just enough to begin the slow process of damaging his liver and kidneys. For the first few weeks, Hendricks noticed nothing. His coffee tasted the same. He felt fine. Rebecca remained the perfect servant, quiet, obedient, efficient. Then, in late February, Hendricks started complaining about fatigue. He was tired all the time, couldn't seem to get enough sleep. He blamed it on the stress of managing the plantation, on getting older, on the South Carolina heat starting early. Rebecca continued the careful poisoning. Small amounts, irregularly spaced to avoid obvious patterns. Sometimes she'd add the poison to his coffee, sometimes to his evening whiskey, sometimes to the food she prepared for his private meals. The irregularity was deliberate. It made the symptoms seem more like illness. If Hendricks had gotten sick immediately after every meal, that would be suspicious. But symptoms that came and went, that seemed to have no clear pattern, looked like a mysterious ailment rather than poisoning. By April, Hendricks's fatigue had worsened. He was losing weight. His appetite was poor. He consulted a physician who examined him and found no obvious cause. The doctor prescribed tonics and rest. The tonics did nothing because the problem wasn't illness, it was poison. And rest wouldn't help when Rebecca was adding more poison every few days. Hendricks's wife, Catherine, was worried. She suggested he might be working too hard, that he should hire an additional overseer to reduce his workload. Hendricks refused. He was too proud to admit weakness, too stubborn to change his routines. So the routines continued, including his continued sexual abuse of Rebecca. Even as he was getting sicker, Hendricks still summoned Rebecca for his assaults, still used her body however he wanted, still treated her as property rather than a person. Rebecca endured these assaults while slowly killing him. She would submit to his violence, then return to the kitchen and add more poison to his food. The irony wasn't lost on her. He thought he had complete power over her, never realizing she was destroying him piece by piece. By summer, Hendricks's condition had deteriorated significantly. He was weak, had lost considerable weight, couldn't work for more than a few hours at a time. His skin had taken on a yellowish tint, a sign his liver was failing. Multiple doctors were consulted. They diagnosed various ailments, liver disease, consumption, perhaps a parasite picked up from the rice fields. They prescribed different treatments, all of which failed because none of them addressed the real problem: consistent, careful poisoning. Hendricks became increasingly dependent on Rebecca and the other house slaves. He needed help walking, needed assistance with basic tasks, spent most of his time in bed or in a chair on the veranda. The other enslaved people noticed Hendricks's decline, but didn't suspect Rebecca. They thought it was divine justice, God punishing a cruel master. Some of them celebrated quietly, grateful that Hendricks was too sick to maintain his usual reign of terror. Rebecca showed appropriate concern for Hendricks's health. She prepared special meals for him, foods the doctors recommended for someone with his symptoms. Nobody knew that those carefully prepared meals contained the very poison that was killing him. Hendricks's assaults on Rebecca became less frequent as his health failed, but they didn't stop completely. Even when he could barely walk, he still exercised his perceived right to use Rebecca's body. The assaults became shorter, less violent, not because Hendricks developed compassion, but because he physically couldn't sustain them. Rebecca endured these final assaults, knowing that each one would be among the last. Hendricks was dying, slowly, painfully, confused about why his body was betraying him. And Rebecca was the one killing him, using the access and trust he'd given her to destroy him from the inside. By fall 1837, Hendricks was bedridden. His liver and kidneys were failing. He was in constant pain, confused, barely able to eat. Catherine hired a nurse to care for him full-time, but Rebecca still prepared his meals and drinks, and Rebecca still added poison. Not as much. Hendricks was already dying, but enough to ensure the process continued, to make sure he suffered every day, to guarantee there would be no miraculous recovery. Hendricks lingered through the winter. The doctors were baffled. His symptoms didn't match any standard disease progression. He should have either recovered or died months earlier. Instead, he existed in a state of prolonged suffering, slowly wasting away. Rebecca watched this with grim satisfaction. She'd planned for Hendricks to suffer, and he was suffering. Every day of pain was payment for what he'd done to her. Every moment of confusion and helplessness was justice for the 6 years he'd made her helpless. In March 1838, 18 months after Rebecca began poisoning him, Malcolm Hendricks finally died. The official cause of death was listed as liver disease of unknown origin. He was 44 years old. His funeral was well attended. Fellow plantation owners praised him as a successful planter and devoted family man. The minister spoke about his Christian faith and his contributions to the community. Catherine and the children wept at his graveside. Rebecca stood with the other house slaves, her face appropriately somber, showing exactly the right amount of grief for a faithful servant mourning her master. Nobody suspected that she was the reason they were having a funeral at all. After Hendricks's death, his estate went through probate. Catherine decided she couldn't manage the plantation alone and would sell most of the assets, including many of the enslaved people. Rebecca was sold in May 1838 to a merchant in Charleston who needed household staff. She left the plantation where she'd been born, where she'd been raped for 6 years, where she'd spent 18 months carefully murdering her rapist. Rebecca's new master was named Thomas Crawford. He was younger than Hendricks, 35 years old, and wealthier, owning a large townhouse in Charleston and multiple business interests. Crawford had a wife and 2 children. He seemed initially to be a better master than Hendricks. He didn't whip people casually. He provided adequate food and housing. He was pragmatic rather than cruel. Rebecca settled into Crawford's household, learning new routines, meeting new people. For several months, things were tolerable. Crawford treated her like valuable property, not with kindness, but without particular cruelty. Then, 6 months after Rebecca arrived, Crawford's wife Mary left to visit her sister in Virginia. She'd be gone for 3 weeks. Crawford was left alone in the house with his children and the enslaved staff. The second night Mary was gone, Crawford summoned Rebecca to his study. Rebecca knew immediately what was coming. She'd seen this before. The wife away, the master suddenly interested in the attractive house slave. The pattern was familiar and sickening. Crawford was more direct than Hendricks had been. He didn't pretend romance or affection. He simply told Rebecca what he expected, made clear what would happen if she refused. Rebecca submitted. She had no choice. Crawford was her master, had legal power over her life, could sell her or beat her, or do worse if she resisted. But as Rebecca left Crawford's study that night, she made the same cold, quiet decision she'd made about Hendricks. Crawford would die. Not quickly, slowly, suffering every step of the way. Rebecca had already done this successfully once. She knew it worked. And she'd refined her methods, understood better now which substances were most effective, which dosing schedules worked best, how to avoid patterns that might trigger suspicion. Crawford's vulnerability was his vanity. He was concerned about his appearance, his status in Charleston society. He used various grooming products, hair tonics, skin preparations, colognes. These products were expensive, ordered from suppliers in Europe, kept in his private chambers. Rebecca was responsible for maintaining Crawford's chambers. She had access to all his bottles and containers, and she had the knowledge to adulterate them without detection. Rebecca began with Crawford's hair tonic, an oil-based preparation he applied every morning. She started adding small amounts of lead acetate, carefully prepared to be invisible in the tonic. Lead poisoning was slow but devastating, causing neurological damage, organ failure, and eventual death. The beauty of lead poisoning was that the symptoms developed gradually and looked like various illnesses. Headaches, fatigue, digestive problems, cognitive issues, all common enough that they wouldn't immediately trigger suspicion of poisoning. Crawford continued his assaults on Rebecca. Once or twice a week, whenever his wife was away or occupied, he would summon Rebecca and use her body. He showed no guilt, no concern for her humanity. To him, this was just a perk of ownership. Rebecca endured these assaults while killing Crawford the same way she'd killed Hendricks. Small amounts of poison, administered consistently, causing cumulative damage that looked like illness. By early 1839, Crawford started experiencing symptoms. Headaches at first, then fatigue, then digestive issues that made him lose weight. He consulted doctors who found no obvious cause and prescribed various treatments. The treatments failed because the problem was lead accumulating in Crawford's system, damaging his brain and organs a little more each day. Rebecca maintained her poisoning campaign with perfect patience. She never hurried, never added more poison than was necessary, never let emotion override calculation. She'd learned from killing Hendricks that slow was better than fast, that patient revenge was more effective than sudden violence. Crawford's condition deteriorated through 1839. His headaches became severe. His cognitive function declined. He had trouble concentrating, would forget things, seemed confused by simple tasks. His hands developed a tremor that made writing difficult. The doctors were puzzled. Crawford's symptoms didn't match any standard disease. They suggested everything from brain fever to early dementia, to exotic tropical illnesses. Nobody tested for lead poisoning, because nobody suspected it. Why would they? Crawford was wealthy, had access to the best medical care, used expensive imported grooming products. The idea that someone was poisoning him through those very products never crossed anyone's mind. And nobody suspected Rebecca. She was just a house slave, quiet and obedient, performing her duties efficiently. The fact that she'd been owned by two masters who'd both died of mysterious illnesses seemed like unfortunate coincidence rather than a pattern. By late 1839, Crawford was seriously ill. His neurological symptoms were pronounced: tremors, confusion, difficulty speaking. He could no longer manage his business affairs. His wife Mary took over running the household and businesses. Crawford's assaults on Rebecca had stopped. He was too sick to continue them. But Rebecca didn't stop poisoning him. She continued adding lead to his hair tonic, ensuring the damage continued, guaranteeing he would suffer as long as possible. Crawford died in February 1840, 20 months after Rebecca began poisoning him. The official cause of death was brain fever, complicated by organ failure. He was 37 years old. His funeral was similar to Hendrix's, well attended, full of praise for his business acumen and family devotion. Mary wept. The children were confused and grieving. The minister spoke about mysterious illnesses that take good men too soon. Rebecca stood with the other household slaves, her face appropriately sad, thinking about how Crawford had raped her regularly for almost 2 years and now was dead because of it. After Crawford's death, Mary decided to move back to Virginia to be near her family. She would sell the Charleston townhouse and most of its contents, including the enslaved people. Rebecca was sold again in April 1840 to a rice planter named James Morrison. Morrison owned a plantation about 30 miles from Charleston. He was 50 years old, wealthy, had a reputation as a hard but fair master. He bought Rebecca because he needed an experienced houseworker. His previous cook had died of fever, and he needed someone capable. Rebecca arrived at Morrison's plantation and went through her now familiar routine, learning new patterns, identifying vulnerabilities, waiting to see what kind of master Morrison would be. For the first year, Morrison left Rebecca alone. He was married, seemed devoted to his wife Sarah, didn't show inappropriate interest in the enslaved women in his household. Rebecca began to hope that maybe this time would be different. Maybe she'd finally been purchased by a master who wouldn't abuse her. Maybe she could just work, survive, avoid the cycle of assault and revenge that had defined her past 4 years. Then Sarah Morrison died in childbirth in June 1841. The baby died too. Morrison was left alone, grieving, with a plantation to run, and no partner to help manage the household. 3 months after Sarah's death, Morrison summoned Rebecca to his study late one evening. Rebecca knew immediately. The pattern was familiar. The grieving widower, lonely and frustrated, turning to the enslaved woman in his household, who had no power to refuse him. Morrison was apologetic about it. That was new. He explained that he missed his wife, that he had needs, that he would make sure Rebecca was treated well if she accommodated him. As if his politeness made the rape somehow less terrible. Rebecca submitted. She had no choice, and she made her decision. Morrison would die just like Hendrix and Crawford, but this time would be different. Rebecca had killed 2 masters successfully, but she'd also been sold twice, disrupting her plans and requiring her to start over. She was tired of being moved around, tired of establishing herself in new households, only to be sold again. This time, Rebecca would be more careful. She would take longer, be even more subtle, make absolutely certain that nobody would suspect her. Morrison's vulnerability was his drinking. He'd started drinking heavily after Sarah's death, using alcohol to numb his grief. Every evening he'd drink whiskey in his study, sometimes falling asleep there instead of going to bed. Rebecca was responsible for keeping Morrison's whiskey decanter filled. She had access to his study, to his bottles, to every drink he consumed in the evening. She began adding arsenic to his whiskey. Not large amounts, just enough to cause chronic poisoning. Arsenic in small doses caused symptoms that looked like various illnesses: digestive problems, skin issues, fatigue, confusion. The dosing was incredibly subtle. Rebecca would add poison once or twice a week, irregular enough that there was no clear pattern. Morrison would drink his poisoned whiskey, feeling the effects gradually, never connecting his worsening health to the alcohol he trusted. Morrison continued assaulting Rebecca regularly. The assaults were different from what she'd experienced with Hendricks or Crawford. Morrison was gentler, more conflicted, would sometimes apologize afterward. But they were still assaults, still violations, still rape. And Rebecca continued poisoning him, patient as ever, knowing that every assault brought Morrison closer to death. By early 1842, Morrison's health was noticeably declining. He had digestive issues, was losing weight, his skin had developed an odd discoloration. Doctors were consulted, treatments prescribed. Nothing helped. Morrison started drinking more heavily, thinking the alcohol would help him feel better. He didn't know the alcohol was the source of his problems, that every drink was slowly killing him. Rebecca watched Morrison deteriorate with the same grim satisfaction she'd felt watching Hendricks and Crawford die. 3 masters, 3 rapists, all slowly destroyed by the woman they thought they owned. Morrison died in September 1842, 18 months after Rebecca began poisoning him. The official cause was listed as digestive disease, complicated by alcohol consumption. He was 52 years old. His funeral was smaller than Hendricks's or Crawford's. Morrison had fewer friends, having isolated himself during his grief. His family came from Virginia, buried him, and began the process of settling his estate. Rebecca was sold once more to a cotton factor in Charleston, who needed household staff. By this point, Rebecca had killed 3 masters over 6 years. Nobody had connected the deaths. They'd occurred in different places, to different men, with different symptoms. The only common factor was Rebecca, and nobody thought an enslaved woman could be responsible for something so sophisticated. The pattern continued. Rebecca would be purchased, would work efficiently, would be assaulted by the men who owned her, would begin slowly poisoning them. 2 more masters died of mysterious illnesses between 1843 and 1847. 5 masters over 11 years, all dead, all from progressive ailments that doctors couldn't explain. And Rebecca moved between households, quiet and obedient, never suspected. The pattern might have continued indefinitely, if not for a doctor named William Price. Price was a physician in Charleston who'd treated 3 of Rebecca's masters, Crawford, Morrison, and the last man who died in 1847. In late 1847, while reviewing his medical notes, Price noticed something strange. All 3 men had developed similar symptoms that didn't match standard disease progressions. All 3 had died despite receiving good medical care. And all 3 had owned the same enslaved woman, Rebecca. Price began investigating. He contacted doctors who'd treated Hendricks and the other master who'd died. Found the same patterns: mysterious illnesses, progressive symptoms, deaths that puzzled experienced physicians. Price brought his findings to the Charleston authorities. They were skeptical. The idea that an enslaved woman had poisoned 5 masters over 11 years without anyone noticing seemed impossible. But Price was persistent. He arranged for Hendricks' body to be exhumed and tested. The tests revealed high levels of toxins consistent with poisoning. The same tests were conducted on Crawford's and Morrison's bodies. Similar results. A warrant was issued for Rebecca's arrest in December 1847. She was taken into custody and charged with multiple counts of murder. The trial began in March 1848. It was a sensation. Newspapers across the South covered it extensively. The idea that an enslaved woman had systematically poisoned 5 masters was both terrifying and fascinating to white society. The prosecution had strong circumstantial evidence. They could show Rebecca had been present in all 5 households. They could show all 5 men had died of poisoning. They could show Rebecca had access to the food, drinks, and personal items that had been poisoned. What they couldn't show was direct proof that Rebecca had administered the poison. Nobody had seen her do it. The methods were so subtle that even looking back, it was hard to identify exactly when and how the poisoning had occurred. Rebecca's court-appointed lawyer argued that the entire case was speculation. Many enslaved people moved between households. Finding toxins in bodies didn't prove Rebecca had put them there. The prosecution was connecting dots that shouldn't be connected. But then the prosecution called witnesses from the enslaved community. Women who'd worked alongside Rebecca, who'd heard her talking about herbs and plants, who'd seen her reading medical books, who remembered her asking questions about which substances caused which symptoms. The evidence accumulated, and when Rebecca was called to testify, she made the same decision she'd made at the end. She was done hiding. "Yes," Rebecca said calmly. "I poisoned them, all 5 of them. They raped me for years, and I made them pay for it." The courtroom erupted. Rebecca's lawyer looked devastated. She'd just convicted herself. But Rebecca kept talking, explaining exactly what each master had done to her, exactly how she'd killed them in return. "Hendricks raped me from the time I was 15 until I was 21, Rebecca said. 6 years of assaults, so I poisoned him for 18 months. Made him suffer like he made me suffer. Crawford bought me and raped me within a week, used me whenever his wife was away. So I poisoned him too. 20 months. Morrison was apologetic about raping me, like his guilt made it better. It didn't. So I killed him just like the others. 18 months. The prosecutor asked if she had any remorse. "No," Rebecca said. "They deserved everything I did to them. They raped me because they could, because the law said I was property. So I used that same access, the trust they gave me, because they thought I was just property, to destroy them. Slowly, painfully, making sure they suffered every step of the way. I wanted them to feel what I felt. Helpless, violated, unable to stop what was happening to them. I wanted them to die slowly, confused about why their bodies were betraying them, just like I was confused about why the law allowed them to betray my body." The jury deliberated for 3 hours. They returned with a guilty verdict on all counts. The judge sentenced Rebecca to death by hanging. Rebecca showed no emotion when the sentence was read. She'd known from the moment she first poisoned Hendricks that if caught, she would die. She'd decided 11 years ago that revenge was worth any price. The execution was scheduled for July 15th, 1848. In the weeks leading up to it, Rebecca became a controversial figure. Abolitionists used her case as evidence of slavery's corruption. Southern newspapers portrayed her as a monster. Enslaved people across the South told her story as a legend of resistance. The morning of the execution, thousands came to watch. White people who wanted to see justice done. Black people who saw Rebecca as a hero who'd fought back when fighting back meant death. Rebecca was brought out at 10 o'clock. She was 33 years old, had spent 11 of those years slowly killing the men who'd raped her. She walked to the gallows without assistance, her head high. The executioner asked for final words. "I killed 5 men," Rebecca said clearly. "Not because I'm evil, but because they were. They raped me repeatedly, used their power over me to violate me, and the law protected them while denying me any recourse. So I found my own recourse. I used the access they gave me, the trust they had in me, because they thought I was just property, to destroy them. I poisoned them slowly, over months, making sure they suffered. I'm not sorry, I'm proud. Proud that I fought back. Proud that I made them pay. Proud that even though I'm about to die, I showed that enslaved people aren't helpless. We can fight back. We can hurt the people who hurt us." To every woman watching who's being violated by men with power over her, you can resist. Maybe not the way I did, but in whatever way you can. Don't accept that their power is absolute. Find the cracks, exploit them, make them pay whatever price you can extract. They're hanging me for refusing to accept rape as part of slavery. That tells you everything you need to know about whose side the law is on. The executioner placed the noose around Rebecca's neck. She stood straight, looking out at the crowd, her expression calm. They pulled the lever. Rebecca dropped. Her neck broke cleanly. The crowd's reaction was divided. Some applauded, others wept. Most stood in complicated silence, unsure what they'd witnessed. Rebecca's story spread across the South. Plantation owners became paranoid about their house slaves. Foods and drinks that had been trusted were now suspect. Some owners reduced how much access enslaved people had to their private items. Medical professionals studied Rebecca's methods, trying to understand how she'd poisoned 5 men over 11 years without detection. Her techniques became case studies in forensic toxicology. But in enslaved communities, Rebecca became a legend. The woman who'd killed 5 masters slowly, patiently, using the access they'd given her against them. Proof that resistance was possible, even in the most controlled circumstances. Songs emerged. Rebecca knew the poison way, made the masters slowly pay. 11 years of patient art broke each master's beating heart. Today, Rebecca has no marker. She was buried in an unmarked grave outside Charleston. No monument commemorates her. No official history acknowledges what she did. But her story survives in oral histories, in the collective memory of resistance that enslaved people maintained, despite every attempt to erase it. Rebecca's legacy is complicated. She killed 5 people, caused prolonged suffering, showed no remorse. By any standard, these are serious crimes. But she did it to men who'd raped her repeatedly, who'd used their legal power as owners to violate her with impunity, who represented a system that denied her humanity while exploiting her body. Was she a murderer or a freedom fighter? A criminal or someone who fought back against criminal abuse using the only weapons available? The answer depends on whether you believe enslaved people had the right to resist their oppression by any means necessary, even means that involved calculated, patient violence against their oppressors. Rebecca believed they did. She spent 11 years acting on that belief, and when caught, she stood on the gallows and told other enslaved women to keep fighting. Remember Rebecca. Remember that she was raped for years by men who owned her. Remember that she used the very access those men gave her, the trust they placed in her as household staff, to slowly poison them. Remember that she killed 5 masters over 11 years, using methods so subtle that nobody suspected her until a doctor noticed the pattern. Remember that when caught, she expressed no remorse, said she'd do it again, told other women to resist however they could, That's the story of Rebecca. Not simple, not comfortable, not easily categorized as right or wrong, but true and worth remembering, because forgetting would mean accepting that enslaved women had no recourse against sexual violence. Forgetting would mean denying that resistance existed even in its most extreme forms. Forgetting would mean erasing one of the most patient, calculated acts of revenge in American history. She was abused by her masters for years, and she killed them slowly, one by one, using poison that took months to work and looked like illness rather than murder. That's America's cruelest revenge. Not cruelest because of the methods, though they were brutal. Cruelest because it was necessary, because the system provided no other justice for women like Rebecca. Remember her. Remember all of it. Was Rebecca justified in killing the men who enslaved and raped her, or did her slow, calculated revenge cross a moral line? Over 11 years, she poisoned 5 abusers, acts born from unimaginable suffering and denied justice. Were they victims or perpetrators who met the consequences of their own cruelty? At History in Chains, we share stories that challenge simple judgment and reveal the blurred lines between justice and vengeance. Rebecca's story forces us to ask, when every lawful path is closed, what does justice look like? Subscribe for more stories that confront history's hardest truths.